It was a little before 8:30 a.m. on a cold January morning when a few of the workshop participants arrived, just as me and my team finished setting out coffee, tea, fruit, and bagels. The cafeteria at the Independence Charter School also doubled as a recreation room, and it was the perfect location for the second story circle for the Red Line Project. For this particular story circle, we were expecting 10 participants. I'd spoken to most of them by telephone prior to this day, and they had all confirmed their participation a couple of days before. This group would include about 5 older residents from the Graduate Hospital neighborhood in South Philadelphia. And the other 5 participants included a mix of older and younger residents from the Point Breeze section of South Philly. As folks were starting to settle in, me and some of the other folks I was working with made informal introductions and made sure everyone had everything that they needed to get comfortable. As I was speaking with Amelia, a new homeowner in the Point Breeze section of the city, I felt a cold wind hit my face as a gentleman threw open the doors. I knew exactly who he was before he even introduced himself. I'd spent at least a half an hour on the phone with him the night before, trying to ensure that this would be a safe space for him to share his story as a homeowner and a real estate agent in the neighborhood. During this call, he told me how sick and tired he was of being labeled as a gentrifier by his neighbors and in the local press. Again, I assured him that this isn't the intention of this project. I was simply trying to provide a space for new and more established residents to share their stories. I'll admit, he did seem to remain skeptical when our conversation ended the night before. But I didn't anticipate the confrontational attitude I felt the moment he bounded into the room. He seemed loaded for bear, and I thanked him for making time to share his story with us on this brisk Saturday morning. But he didn't seem to have time for pleasantries, as he loudly reiterated he wasn't there to be called a gentrifier by me or the other participants in the project. I took a deep breath as I instinctively knew this was a mistake. Inviting this cat to be a part of my project, the Red Line Project, wasn't going to work. Immediately feeling protective of the other willing participants, I steered him to the big blue doors at the end of the hallway, and as graciously as I could, I admitted my mistake in inviting him. I apologized for wasting his time and sent him on his way. As I returned to the room, I wish I'd had some sage to burn to extinguish the funky energy his presence had unleashed in what would soon be our sacred space. The Red Line Project is a community building and digital storytelling project that I facilitated in 2015 in the Graduate Hospital and Point Breeze neighborhoods of South Philadelphia. Through 3 curated story circles, residents shared their first-person accounts of how they've been impacted by the changing demographics of their neighborhood. The stories and images collected through this project are a public record of what stood before gentrification and the hopes and dreams of both the long-standing and new residents in these communities. The catalyst for the Red Line Project is my personal history with South Philadelphia. I'm very familiar with the neighborhood because it's where my mother grew up. My parents raised me out in the burbs just outside of West Philadelphia, but most weekends growing up, I spent in South Philly with my grandparents and my cousins. A few years after graduating from college, I returned to the same neighborhood in South Philadelphia on Pemberton Street. I loved that while walking my dog, I'd run into neighbors who knew who I came from just by looking at me. Yes, I am Big Ray's granddaughter and Little Ray's daughter. No, Miss Mabel, I won't forget this Saturday is the neighborhood cleanup. I appreciated Miss Mabel's assumption that as a member of this community, I would join my neighbors in keeping the block clean and presentable. I didn't feel that same connection in the neighborhood I grew up and lived in with my parents. And I craved that same sense of belonging that I felt on Pemberton Street. Living on Pemberton Street might be the first time I felt like I was really a part of a community. A few years later, my husband Gene and I got priced out as the wave of gentrification began to really overtake the neighborhood. We ended up buying a home in the northwest section of the city in Germantown. And a few years later, we bought our current home in Lansdowne, Pennsylvania. Alongside these moves, I maintained my connection with South Philly. We often visited family and friends who remained in the neighborhood. And each time we were awestruck by the speed of change in these communities, the new condominiums, the construction that never seemed to end, the black churches that we saw being torn down, seeing more white faces and families walking the streets. The dictionary's definition of gentrification doesn't mention race, but let's be honest. Can you think of any neighborhoods that have been identified as gentrified when an influx of black and brown people move in? Gentrification meets at the intersection of race and class, plain and simple. And the dynamics of the graduate hospital community, as I knew and remembered, had been irrevocably disrupted by this. The Red Line Project was me stepping off the sidelines and getting into the game to address and identify the roots of this disruption and to learn how we can maintain our community. How can we keep it intact? Today, we find ourselves as a society in a different wave of disruption. The informality of our daily engagement with others has been disrupted by COVID-19 and a collective, multiracial, and intergenerational response to the rampant police brutality and racism towards African Americans in the United States. Reflecting on my experiences living in South Philly, conducting the Red Line Project, and the multiple disruptions we're navigating today, all while being forced to engage more via technology, I wonder, how do we create and foster community in this space? Can we even create a community in a virtual space? I believe we can. In fact, I think it's imperative we actively and intentionally practice fostering community in virtual spaces using technology precisely because of the circumstances we now find ourselves in. Humans, by nature, are social beings. Because of COVID-19, we're being forced to socially distance. But our innate sense as humans is to gather and be with people. How can we maintain our mental and emotional well-being while following this mandate to ensure our health and the health of those around us? We all know that words matter. And I, for one, I'm chucking the idea of social distancing and using the more appropriate term, physical distancing. But now, more than ever, we need to be in community to combat the sense of isolation that comes when being encouraged to remove ourselves from our normal routine of working and living with others outside of our immediate family. For the last 4 months, I've been grappling with the lack of established protocols in engagement and community building in a virtual space. Things like, is it appropriate for some of us to have our cameras on while others have theirs off? Or should the mics be off except for the person who's speaking or the one responding? I know it's hard for me to read the room if everyone's camera's off. Does it mean that the person I'm speaking with really has little interest in engaging with me, or should I try not to take it so personally? Could it simply be that when that little green camera light on your computer comes on, our vulnerability heightens? Despite being skilled at presenting a curated life via social media, the authenticity of what the computer or cell phone's camera captures in real time can often be overwhelming. About 2 weeks in Pennsylvania's stay-at-home order, I started feeling antsy and wanted to engage with more than just my staff at Philly Young Playwrights and my husband and kids. So I jumped on Facebook and asked if anyone was interested in participating in a virtual screening salon. It's like a book club, but instead of everyone reading the same book, we agree to watch the same movie or series on Netflix or Amazon Prime. More than 30 of my Facebook friends immediately chimed in and said yes, they were interested in participating. But for our first meeting, only about 9 of us logged onto Zoom for our first discussion. We've been getting together every Saturday since late March, and it's been great. Our conversations veer off topic from whatever movie that week to more personal conversations on how we're navigating this new reality of working remotely and physical distancing. Or sometimes our conversations get more emotional about the civic disruptions we see in cities around us. Not everyone can show up every week, but our group has grown to about 20 semi-regular participants. I've reconnected with folks I lost contact with after college. A wonderful woman I met on a yoga retreat last September participates. My mother joins in on most Saturdays. And my cousin Allison has invited some of her friends from college who live all over the country to participate. A few of the women I met at the gym participate. And it's become a great mix of women from various backgrounds who have become a needed respite for many of us at the end of a busy week. In building this community, I'm witnessing the earning of trust and the opportunity to come from behind our professional facade while dropping the figurative mask we've all been socialized to assume to make it from one day to the next. We offer each other grace and empathy if some of us aren't always available to show up, recognizing that we all have lives beyond the computer screen. But every person who logs on for our weekly discussion is greeted with open arms. With both of these experiences I've shared, the Red Line Project and the Screening Salon, I initiated and created a forum for folks to engage. And more importantly, the folks I and others invited showed up. They said yes, they were willing to engage. My intention was to create a space of empathy, which allowed the participants to feel safe and supported in sharing their stories and experiences. All of the participants, myself included, not only showed up, but we did with a willingness to be open to the possibility of establishing and fostering new relationships. Through these initiatives, I've learned trust is an invaluable asset in building community. When I first moved to Pemberton Street, many of the older neighbors automatically trusted me because they knew my people. Most of the participants in the Red Line Project stepped out on faith and participated in the story circles because they knew and trusted their neighbors who also agreed to participate in the project. Participants in our virtual screening salon initially checked it out because they were invited to participate by someone they trusted. Virtual community building simply takes more time and requires an investment of both time and intentionality. What might usually be initiated in one setting if we were in person now may require multiple meetings, but each meeting doesn't have to include a formal agenda. Introducing a few low-stake activities simply allow folks to get to know each other are usually extremely beneficial. And finally, allow yourself to be vulnerable. Stepping out of your comfort zone is stress-inducing, but usually when we show up as our authentic selves, others gravitate and often see parts in themselves in what we've shared. As we're all trying to find our sea legs during this movement of disruption, looking for ways to push past this technology. And whether you're an initiator like me or an enthusiastic co-conspirator, are you ready to say yes? Yes to doing the communal hard work to keep our communities safe and dismantle racism?